Deal. The call came in at 7:43 on a Wednesday morning, and I almost didn't pick up because I didn't recognize the number. It was a property manager named Cliff, someone I'd done a few jobs for the previous fall. Outdoor lighting at a waterfront place in West Vancouver, a panel swap in a townhouse off Marine Drive. He said one of his clients needed emergency electrical work done that morning. A security interlock on an automated gate had failed overnight, and the system was stuck in a fault loop that kept triggering the alarm every 40 seconds. He needed someone there before 9. I said I could be there by 8:15. He gave me the address in West Van, up in the hills above the highway, and then he paused for just a second before saying, "You'll know whose house it is when you get there. Just keep your head down and do the work." I didn't think much about that until I pulled off the upper road and saw the camera lenses. There were 4 or 5 of them parked along the narrow shoulder, 2 SUVs and a couple of sedans, men standing beside them with long equipment bags, and that patient, practiced stillness of people who do a lot of waiting. One of them glanced at my truck and looked away immediately. I wasn't interesting. The gate was halfway open. Not fully. Not closed. Just stuck at that awkward angle that made it useless in both directions. A security guy in a dark jacket flagged me in before I'd even rolled the window down. He had the look of someone who had been awake too long and was working hard not to show it. "You're the electrician?" "Yeah. Come through. Leave the truck just inside." I pulled in, got out, and grabbed my bag. The property was quiet in that particular way expensive places get. Sound absorbed by distance and landscaping, and the sheer amount of space between you and the next thing. Below the gate the road curved downhill. Behind me through stone pillars and the edge of a cedar hedge, I could hear one of the photographers talking quietly into a phone. The security guy, he told me his name was Derek, walked me over to the control housing beside the gate column. He pulled it open, and I crouched and looked inside and saw right away what had happened. A moisture seal on the sensor board had degraded, water had tracked in along the conduit, probably during the rain 2 nights ago, and one of the feedback loops was reading a phantom obstruction. Every time the motor tried to complete the closed cycle, it hit the false signal and faulted back to alarm. Simple enough to fix if you had the right parts, which I did. I was maybe 6 minutes into the work when I heard footsteps on the stone behind me. Is it actually fixable, or is that going to be a whole thing? I turned around without planning to. She was standing about 4 meters back, arms crossed over a cream-colored coat, dark hair pulled up in a way that looked like she'd done it fast. I knew her face. Everybody knew her face. Adrienne Foss had been doing serious television for about 10 years. The kind of prestige stuff that wins awards and gets written about in long magazine features. She had been in 2 films the previous year. There was a profile of her in a national newspaper magazine the month before that I'd seen at my dentist's office. None of that was what I registered first. What I registered first was that she looked exhausted in a way that wasn't the kind you got from a late night. It was the kind you got from something ongoing. She had dark circles she hadn't bothered to cover, and her eyes moved past me to the gate and then down to the road and the cars beyond it before they came back to me. "It's fixable," I said. "Hour, maybe less." She nodded once and looked back at the gate. "Good. Because I have somewhere to be at 11 and I'd like to leave without an audience." She went back toward the house. Derek exhaled slowly beside me. "How long have they been out there?" I asked. "Since yesterday afternoon." "For what?" He shook his head in a way that meant he wasn't going to answer that, which was answer enough. I got back to work. 40 minutes later, the gate ran clean. I cycled it 3 times, checked the contact points, reseated the seal as best I could with what I had, and left Derek a note about the permanent fix that should be done before the next rain. He tested it himself twice and then said he'd tell Adrienne it was done. I was packing up my bag when she came back out. She had changed into something darker, had a bag over one shoulder, and was moving with the quick, contained energy of someone trying to get from one place to another before anything could stop her. She looked at the gate, watched it roll shut, and then looked at me. "Thank you," she said. Which sounds simple, but she said it in a way that made it clear she meant it. "No problem." She tilted her head slightly. "You got here fast. Cliff called early. Cliff calls everyone early." Something in her face shifted, just fractionally. Not a smile exactly, but the thing before a smile. "Do you do interior work?" "There's a dimmer switch in the main hallway that's been flickering for 3 weeks, and every electrician I've called has either not shown up or told me it's fine when it's clearly not fine." I told her I could look at it. That was the beginning of it. though I didn't know that yet. The dimmer switch was easy. Bad wiring on the load terminal. Previous install had used an undersized wire gauge for the fixture. I replaced the switch, re-terminated it properly, and the flicker was gone in under half an hour. While I was there, she mentioned that a ceiling fixture in the guest room had stopped working entirely, and then that an outdoor outlet on the back deck had been tripping the breaker every time the string lights were plugged in. I stayed until noon. There was no particular moment where she decided to keep calling. It just happened. Cliff sent me back 2 days later for a panel inspection she'd requested. Then she texted the number Cliff had given her to ask if I could come back Thursday for the deck outlet. At some point I stopped going through Cliff. By the second week I knew the house well enough to move through it without being shown where things were. The place was big without being absurd. 4 bedrooms. A lower level with a studio space and a separate entrance. Views of the inlet from most of the upper rooms. It sat on a property that was heavily hedged on 3 sides, which mattered more than you'd think. She could sit on the back deck without being seen from the road. The staff situation was minimal compared to what I'd expected. There was a housekeeper named Florence, who came Mondays and Thursdays, a property manager who handled the exterior and the landscaping, and an assistant who worked remotely most of the time and came in person maybe twice a week. That was it. The house was quiet most days in a way that surprised me. I'd assumed famous people lived in constant noise. I started to understand that she had built the quiet deliberately. The first time we had a real conversation was a Thursday afternoon. I was replacing a junction box in the utility room off the garage and she came in to get something from a shelf and then didn't leave. She stood there holding a box of printer paper and asked me how long I'd been doing electrical work. I told her about my grandfather, who'd been a licensed electrician in Ontario for 30 years, and how I'd started going to job sites with him when I was 11. How I'd done an apprenticeship right out of high school, got my red seal, moved to BC 6 years ago when a friend told me the work was steadier. She asked questions. Real ones. Not the polite kind people ask when they're waiting for their turn to talk, but the kind that meant she'd actually heard what I said. She asked what the red seal meant, whether it transferred between provinces, whether I'd ever considered other trades. When I asked why she was curious, she said she'd grown up watching her father do manual work. He'd been a Finnish carpenter in Edmonton, and that she still found it calming to be around people who fix things. Most of the people I deal with professionally make things more complicated, she said. It's nice to watch something actually get solved. I told her I wasn't sure my work was that interesting. It is to me, she said, and then she took the printer paper and left. I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon more than I should have. Things shifted gradually after that. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in stories where there's one specific scene and you can point to it afterward and say that was the moment. It was quieter than that. Here. It was the way she started staying when she didn't need to. The way she'd come down to wherever I was working with 2 cups of tea and set one beside me without asking if I wanted any. The way our conversations got longer without either of us trying to make them longer. One evening, I'd stayed late to finish a panel upgrade before she had people over the following day. I was cleaning up in the lower level, and she came down in a thick sweater and socks, looking nothing like any version of her I'd seen in photographs, and she leaned in the doorway and asked if I'd eaten anything since I'd been there. I said I'd had something in the truck at lunch. She looked at me for a moment. Come upstairs. She made pasta, not from a jar, from scratch, or close to it. She made a sauce with canned tomatoes and garlic, and a spoonful of something from a tin she pulled from the back of a cupboard, and she stood at the stove stirring it, while I sat at the kitchen island and we talked. She told me about shooting a film the previous year in rural Nova Scotia, about staying in a rented house by herself in a town with 1 grocery store, and how it was the most normal she'd felt in 4 years, about calling her mother every Sunday afternoon, no matter where she was in the world. I told her about my younger brother, who'd just started his own business in Hamilton, and was struggling the way everyone struggles at the beginning. About my grandmother in Sudbury who still sent me birthday cards with $20 bills inside. We ate at the kitchen island and it felt completely ordinary, in a way that it absolutely was not. After that I noticed the looks from Florence. Nothing said, just small pauses, small observations. The way her eyes moved between Adrian and me when they found us talking, the way she seemed to note that the electric work that should have been finished on Wednesday was still bringing me back on Friday. I filed it away and didn't say anything about it. Adrian noticed too. I could tell because she became slightly more formal when Florence was around. Shorter exchanges, more task-focused, more distance. Then, when it was just us again, she was easier than she'd been before. Like she'd been holding something in for a few hours and could set it down. I should have been more careful at that point. I knew what was happening, the slow accumulation of time and conversation, and ease in a way that doesn't announce itself. It just builds. I kept telling myself it was fine because nothing had happened, and that was true, and I kept not examining that reasoning too closely because I didn't want to. There was a Sunday afternoon in early October, the light, that particular low gold color you get in the Pacific Northwest before the rains come back for good. I was on the back deck, replacing a fixture bracket that had corroded through. Adrian was inside, but the door was open, and at some point she came out and sat in one of the chairs, with a book she wasn't really reading, and we didn't talk much, just existed in the same space while the city spread out below us in the haze. After a while she said, "Do you ever think about how strange it is? The way people decide what your life looks like from the outside?" I asked her what she meant. "There are articles," she said, "that describe what I'm like. My routine, what I believe, what I want. And some of it is accurate and most of it is just assembled. Like someone took the pieces that were available and built a version of me out of them, and then that version became the one people think they know." I set down the bracket and looked at her. "Does that bother you?" She considered it. "It bothers me less than it used to. What bothers me now is when I notice myself performing for it. When I'm in the grocery store and I see someone recognize me and I feel myself rearrange. I hate that." "You didn't rearrange just now." She looked at me for a moment. "No," she said. "I didn't." I picked the bracket back up and kept working, and I could feel her watching me for a few seconds before she went back to her book. That was when it stopped being something I could explain away. I started being more careful about when I parked on the street, about how long I stayed, about whether Florence or the property manager could see my truck in the driveway from the road. I told myself I was just being professional. That wasn't the whole truth. One evening we were sitting in the front room after I'd finished a job, tea cooling on the table between us. And she showed me something on her phone without explaining what it was first. A piece from one of those gossip aggregate sites. It was vague the way that kind of writing always is. No names, phrased as speculation, but it talked about a Canadian actress known for keeping her private life private and a regular presence at her home who wasn't connected to her industry. Neither of us said anything for a moment. "Could be about anyone," I said. "Could be." She set the phone face down. I looked at the table. "Has this happened before? This kind of thing?" "Yes." "Usually when there's actually nothing to find, they get bored eventually." She paused. "Sometimes before that, someone decides they've found something whether they have or not." I understood what she was telling me. I drove home that night going over it the whole way. Not the gossip item specifically, but the thing under it. The fact that we were careful because we needed to be careful, not because we were doing nothing. The fact that careful wasn't the same as fine. The thing that clarified it happened on a Saturday about 2 weeks later. I'd come by to finish a job in the lower level, a dedicated circuit for her home office equipment that we'd been working around her schedule to complete. She'd told me the house would be empty most of the day. She had meetings in the city, wouldn't be back until late afternoon. I had the code for the lower entrance. I was almost done when I heard the front door. Not her. 2 voices. Her publicist, whose name I knew from being there enough times, and someone I didn't recognize talking at the pace of people mid-conversation, who'd just walked in from outside. Then a third set of footsteps. Then Adrian's voice, which meant she'd come back earlier than planned. I stood there in the lower level, tools on the floor around me, listening to the sounds of people moving overhead, and I did the accounting very quickly. If I went up through the main stairs, I walked through the kitchen where they'd be. If I went out the lower entrance, I was fine, but I'd left my main bag upstairs by the hallway closet. I texted Adrian. "Finished early, still here, didn't know you were back." "Lower level." Her reply came after about 90 seconds. "Stay there. I'll come to you." It was another 20 minutes before she came downstairs. The voices above me continued the whole time. At one point someone walked directly over where I was standing, and I heard the floor creak and held very still. Which was ridiculous because no one was looking for me, and I hadn't done anything wrong. But ridiculousness doesn't stop you from holding still. When she came down, she closed the stairwell door quietly behind her. She looked at me and I looked at her, and after a second she put one hand over her mouth and laughed once, a short exhausted sound. My publicist decided we should meet in person to go over something she could have emailed me, she said. She does this. I could have just gone out the lower door. You left your bag upstairs. I know. We stood there. I could still hear voices overhead. This is getting complicated, she said. It wasn't a question or a complaint, just an observation, said quietly, the way you say something you've been thinking about for a while. Yeah, I said. She leaned back against the wall and looked at the ceiling for a second. It's not your fault. It's not anybody's fault. No. She looked back at me. But it doesn't get easier from here. That's the thing. If anything it. She stopped. The people outside gates, Declan. That's what I mean. Her. Once there's something real to find, the space between what's private and what isn't gets very small. She used my name and it landed differently than it should have. I picked up my tools from the floor and she went back upstairs. When her publicist and the other person left 40 minutes later, she texted me to come up, and I got my bag and we sat in the kitchen for a while without talking much. There wasn't anything new to say. We'd both been thinking the same thing for the same amount of time. A few days after that, Derek found me out by the back gate doing a check on the exterior lighting. He was easy about it, relaxed, which made me pay more attention. You've been around a lot, he said. She's got a lot of electrical issues. He gave a short nod. She does. A pause. You doing anything else after this? What do you mean? Job-wise, anything lined up? It wasn't subtle. He wasn't trying to be subtle. I looked at him, and he looked back, and we both understood the conversation that was actually happening. I've got work, I said. Good, he said, and that was all. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't thinking about it before that. I was. I'd been thinking about it since the night with the gossip item. But Derek saying it out loud moved something that had been possibility into something closer to reality, and I drove home that evening knowing I had to figure out what I was going to do. The job offer came 3 days later. Not by coincidence, I don't think. A facilities manager at a mid-sized hotel in Kelowna contacted me through my trade association profile. They were looking for a full-time senior electrician, housing allowance, benefits, annual salary that was more than I was making freelance. I had the qualifications, I had the experience, and Kelowna was 4 hours away. I sat with it for 2 days before I told Adrian. When I did, we were in the studio space in the lower level. She'd been using it to run lines for something. There were pages spread out on the table. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she looked at the table. Kelowna, she said. Yeah, that's good work. That's what you're trained for. I know. She looked up. Are you asking me whether you should take it? I thought about it, honestly. No, I think I already know. I'm just telling me. Her voice was careful, steady. Yeah. We sat with it for a while. Outside the window, the sky had gone dark early the way it does in October in BC, rain against the glass. The city lights blurred below the hill. I don't know what I would have said, she told me eventually. If this had been different, if the situation had been. She stopped and started differently. I want to tell you it wouldn't have mattered. Cameras, the articles, all of it. I want to tell you that. She looked at me directly. But I've watched it happen to other people, and I know how quickly what's real gets rearranged into something it isn't. And once that starts, you can't make it stop. You just live with it. I nodded. You deserve not to have that, she said. I looked at her. So do you. That landed quietly between us. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then. I'm glad you stayed as long as you did. There was something about the way she said it that made it harder than any argument could have. No anger. No blame. Just honest. Me too, I said. You fixed things, she said. You didn't try to be anything else. I understood what she meant, that I hadn't come in looking for access or stories or proximity to whatever her life was in the version people imagined. I'd come to fix a gate and I'd fixed a gate, and everything after that had been real and unplanned and quiet in the way that real things usually are. A week later, I said goodbye to her on the back deck, late afternoon, the inlet silver in the fall light, below us. No ceremony. We'd never been people who made things into ceremonies. She said, come back if you're ever in the city and something needs fixing. I said, you've got my number. She smiled at that. A real one. The kind I'd seen maybe a dozen times over the course of 2 months, and that I'd understood after the first few was not given out easily. I drove down the hill and the gate opened clean behind me, and the street below was empty. I thought about calling my brother on the drive, but I didn't end up doing that. I just drove. The highway south through the canyon, the mountains on both sides going dark, the radio low, the kind of quiet that feels like something after it's over rather than during. Some things don't have a clean lesson. They're just something that happened, that was real, that you carry forward as something true rather than something finished. I started the Kelowna job the following Monday. The hotel's electrical system was a disaster, and it took me most of the first week just to map it. The work was good. I was good at it. That part stayed the same.